tragic bride haunts the ghost in the apartment building. Alex, a young executive, moves into a sleek apartment complex for a job transfer, eager to start a new chapter. However, his excitement fades when eerie occurrences disrupt his night's faint knocks, ghostly shadows, and whispers in the silence. A chilling elevator encounter with a mysterious woman in black sets the stage for a haunting revelation. Drawn to investigate, Alex discovers the tragic story of a woman abandoned by her fiancé, who took her life in apartment 2001. Her restless spirit lingers, trapped in a cycle of sorrow and vengeance. As Alex confronts the ghost, he learns the depth of her anguish and uncovers the dark secrets buried in the building's past. Determined to end the haunting, he seeks to bring her peace. In this gripping tale of fear, tragedy, and redemption, Alex faces not only the terror of the unknown but also the fragile line between life and death. The haunting is more than supernatural. It's a test of empathy and courage in the face of despair. Part 1. A fresh start. The sun was beginning to set as Alex stood in front of the towering apartment complex that would now be his home. The sleek, modern design glinted in the fading daylight, and its reflective glass seemed to hold the city's pulse within its shimmering facade. He couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. This move was a significant step forward in his career, a reward for years of relentless effort and determination. The spacious apartment, high above the city's chaos, symbolized his success and the beginning of a new chapter. With a deep breath, Alex stepped through the glass doors into the building's opulent lobby. The marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of chandelier lighting, and the faint scent of fresh flowers wafted through the air. It was everything he had imagined and more. "Welcome, Mr. Brooks," the receptionist greeted him warmly. "Your apartment is ready for you on the 20th floor. The elevator is to your left." "Thank you," Alex replied, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. Change, even when positive, had a way of stirring unease. As the elevator ascended, Alex found himself staring at his reflection in the polished steel doors. The faint hum of the machinery seemed louder in the confined space, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the air was heavier than it should be. When the elevator pinged softly, the doors slid open to reveal a pristine hallway bathed in warm, ambient light. Apartment 2001 was at the end of the hall. The door swung open smoothly as Alex turned the key, revealing a stunning modern space. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the far wall, offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. The furniture was sleek yet inviting, with neutral tones that exuded understated elegance. He stepped inside and let the door close behind him. For a moment, he just stood there, taking it all in. The silence was profound, a stark contrast to the bustling streets below. Yet there was something about the quiet that felt off. It wasn't just stillness, it was the kind of silence that pressed against his eardrums, making him hyper-aware of his own breathing. Alex shook his head, laughing at himself. "It's just a new place," he muttered. "I'll get used to it," he said about unpacking, methodically arranging his belongings to make the space feel like home. Books lined the shelves, family photos adorned the mantel, and his favorite leather armchair claimed its spot by the window. Yet, no matter how much of his personality he infused into the space, the unease lingered like an unwelcome guest. As night fell, the city lights flickered to life, creating a mesmerizing display outside his window. Alex poured himself a glass of wine and stood there, admiring the view. The worries of the day began to fade, replaced by a sense of accomplishment. This was his life now, a symbol of everything he had worked for. But then, just as he began to relax, he noticed something odd. A shadow flickered across the glass, darting from the corner of his eye. He turned quickly, expecting to see someone behind him, but the apartment was empty. His heart quickened as he scanned the room, his eyes lingering on the dark corners where the light didn't reach. "It's nothing," he said aloud, his voice echoing slightly in the stillness. "Probably just a reflection yet." As he settled into bed later that night, the unease returned with a vengeance. The silence was no longer comforting, it was oppressive, almost suffocating. Every small sound seemed amplified: the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the floorboards, and then knock, knock, knock. The sound was soft but deliberate, coming from somewhere behind his headboard. Alex froze, his pulse hammering in his ears. He told himself it was the pipes or maybe the neighbors, but the rhythm was too precise, too intentional. He sat up, straining to listen, but the sound stopped. For several minutes he sat in the darkness, his breath shallow and his muscles tense. Finally, he lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. When morning arrived, Alex was groggy and irritable. The sunlight streaming through the windows did little to dispel the lingering unease from the night before. He convinced himself that it was just first-night jitters and threw himself into his morning routine, eager to focus on his new job. As he stepped into the elevator, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air felt cold, unnaturally so, and he found himself glancing at the mirrored walls, half expecting to see someone or something behind him. The elevator descended smoothly, but as it passed the 19th floor, a sudden jolt made Alex grip the handrail. The lights flickered briefly before stabilizing, and the elevator resumed its journey as if nothing had happened. By the time he reached the lobby, Alex had convinced himself that he was overreacting. "It's just an old building," he muttered. "Nothing to worry about." But as he walked out into the bustling city streets, he couldn't help but glance over his shoulder, his mind replaying the sound of the knocking and the flickering shadow in the glass. That evening, he returned to the apartment, determined to make it his sanctuary. He turned on every light, played music on his speakers, and cooked himself a hearty meal. For a while, the activity seemed to chase away the unease. But when night fell, and the city outside quieted, the oppressive silence returned. As Alex lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he swore he could feel eyes on him. Then, the knocking began again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Alex bolted upright, his heart pounding. He turned on the bedside lamp and scanned the room, but there was nothing there. He got up, his bare feet cold against the hardwood floor, and pressed his ear to the wall. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that made his skin crawl. Alex stood there for a long moment, his breath shallow, his senses heightened. Then, just as he was about to step away, he heard it again this time. Faint whispers, so quiet he couldn't make out the words. He backed away from the wall, his mind racing. "It's just my imagination," he whispered. But the words felt hollow, even to him. As he crawled back into bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift in the corners of the room, and the whispers grew louder, though they were still unintelligible. For hours, Alex lay there, his eyes wide open, his body rigid with fear. The city lights outside his window provided little comfort, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. By the time dawn broke, Alex felt like a shell of himself. The oppressive silence had faded with the daylight, but the memory of the knocking and whispers lingered, gnawing at his sanity. He knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever was happening in this apartment, it wasn't normal. Part 2. First night's unease. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in a sea of glowing lights. Alex sat by the large window of his apartment, sipping a glass of wine, trying to let the beauty of the skyline calm his nerves. The vibrant hues of orange and red from the sunset had faded, replaced by a cool darkness that enveloped his surroundings. Yet, instead of feeling at peace, Alex felt a peculiar weight in the air. It wasn't loud or overt. It was subtle, just enough to unsettle him. A slight chill crept across the back of his neck, as though someone had opened a window, but the glass was firmly shut. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of his mind after a long day. As the minutes passed, the silence began to feel oppressive. There was something unnatural about it, like the world had been muted just for him. Alex shook his head and laughed nervously. "You're just tired, man," he muttered. "Get some sleep." He stood, stretching, and turned off the living room light. As darkness crept into the corners of the apartment, his hand froze on the light switch. In his peripheral vision, something shifted just for a moment. A flicker of movement in the corner of the room near the hallway leading to the bedroom. Alex turned his head sharply, his heart pounding. The space was empty. The dim city lights streaming through the window barely illuminated the room, but he could see clearly enough. There was nothing there. A nervous chuckle escaped his lips. "Stop scaring yourself," he whispered, his voice breaking the eerie stillness. But his chest tightened as he glanced back toward the hallway, expecting to see something or someone lurking in the shadows. He moved toward the bedroom, trying to ignore the growing unease. As he passed the kitchen, the overhead light flickered once, briefly plunging the room into darkness before glowing steady again. Alex froze mid-step, staring at the light. Just an old bulb, he reasoned aloud, though his voice lacked conviction. When he reached the bedroom, he closed the door firmly behind him, as though the act could seal out the strange sensations. The bed looked inviting, with its crisp, clean sheets and soft pillows. He slipped under the covers, the familiar comfort lulling him into a fragile sense of safety. The clock on the nightstand glowed faintly, its digits clicking forward with each passing second. He closed his eyes, willing sleep to take him. Knock, knock. The sound was faint but distinct. Alex's eyes shot open, his heart hammering in his chest. He held his breath, straining to listen. Knock, knock. This time it was louder, more deliberate. It came from the wall just behind his headboard. Alex sat up, his body rigid with tension. His mind scrambled for logical explanations. Maybe it was the neighbors. Maybe the walls were thin and someone was moving furniture. Or perhaps it was the pipes old building sometimes made strange noises. Pipes, he muttered to himself, trying to convince his racing heart. It's just the pipes. But the sound came again, this time closer, as if someone was tapping gently, deliberately, just behind him. Alex swallowed hard, feeling his throat go dry. The air in the room felt heavier, colder, and he could swear the faintest whisper was accompanying the knocks, too soft to understand but chilling nonetheless. He stood slowly, his bare feet sinking into the plush rug. Turning on the bedside lamp, he scanned the room. Nothing. The walls were solid, blank. The only sound was his own ragged breathing. Alex approached the wall cautiously, pressing his ear against the cold surface. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then tap. Tap. He jerked back, nearly stumbling. The sound was so close it felt like it had come from the other side of the wall, directly at his ear. Adrenaline coursed through him as he stepped away, glancing toward the door. His hand hovered near the doorknob, debating whether to investigate further or retreat entirely. But the rational part of his brain told him there was no one on the other side of the wall. It was just the hallway leading to his living room. The knocks stopped as abruptly as they had started. The room plunged into an eerie stillness, but the cold, oppressive atmosphere lingered. Alex shook his head, laughing nervously. It's nothing. Probably just the building settling. He climbed back into bed, pulling the blanket up to his chest. He left the lamp on this time, unwilling to face the darkness. Minutes passed, then hours. Sleep evaded him, his mind racing with images of shadows and flickering lights. He stared at the ceiling, trying to focus on the steady hum of the refrigerator in the distance. Then came the whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like the sound of the wind brushing against a window. But there was no wind. No window nearby. Alex's pulse quickened. He sat up again, this time with a growing sense of dread. His eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the sound. "Hello?" He called out, his voice trembling. The whisper stopped. For several minutes, Alex sat frozen, every muscle in his body tense. The silence was deafening, a suffocating void that made the hair on his arm stand on end. And then, from the far corner of the room, he saw it. A shadow. It was faint, barely visible in the dim glow of the lamp, but it was there. A figure standing motionless in the corner, darker than the shadows around it. Alex's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, and the shadow was gone. He let out a shaky breath, gripping the blanket tightly. His rational mind told him it was a trick of the light, an overactive imagination fueled by exhaustion. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The unease followed him into the early hours of the morning. When the first rays of sunlight pierced through the window, Alex felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The daylight chased away the oppressive darkness. and for the first time in hours, he felt like he could breathe again. But even as he got up to face the new day, the memory of the knocking, the whispers, and the shadow lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had been with him in the room that night. And worse, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't finished with him yet. Part 3. The elevator encounter. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, bathing Alex's apartment in a soft golden light. He stood by the kitchen counter, sipping a bitter cup of coffee and trying to shake off the restless night. His eyes were heavy, his mind clouded with the lingering unease from the strange knocks and whispers. But daylight had a way of dulling fears, making the night's events feel distant, almost unreal. Dressed sharply in a tailored suit, Alex grabbed his briefcase and headed out the door. The sterile white walls of the hallway felt oddly comforting after the oppressive atmosphere of his apartment. He approached the elevator and pressed the button, the faint hum of its machinery breaking the eerie quiet. When the doors slid open, the elevator was empty. Alex stepped inside, his shoes clicking softly against the polished floor. He pressed the button for the lobby and leaned against the mirrored wall, letting out a tired sigh. Just as the doors were about to close, a hand shot through the gap, triggering the sensors. Alex startled, his heart skipping a beat. The door slid open again to reveal a woman. She stepped in silently, her movements fluid yet unnervingly stiff. She wore a long black dress that seemed slightly out of place for the morning hour, its hem brushing the floor as she moved. Her head was bowed, her face obscured by a curtain of dark hair. She didn't acknowledge Alex, didn't speak, didn't even glance in his direction. Alex's first instinct was to greet her a polite good morning perhaps, but something about her presence made his words catch in his throat. The air inside the elevator grew heavier, colder, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees the moment she entered. "Which floor?" he asked after a long pause, his voice breaking the silence. She didn't respond. Instead, she stood motionless, her back slightly turned toward him, as if she hadn't heard the question or chose to ignore it. Alex frowned, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He glanced at the buttons on the control panel. None were lit except for the one he'd already pressed for the lobby. The elevator began its descent, the hum of its motors filling the oppressive silence. Alex tried to shake off his discomfort, reminding himself that it was early, and maybe the woman was just tired or preoccupied. Yet, there was something unsettling about her stillness, the way she stood so rigidly, not swaying with the gentle motion of the elevator. As they passed the 20th floor, Alex found himself glancing at her reflection in the mirrored walls. To his surprise, she wasn't looking at the floor or the buttons. Her head was slightly turned, as if she were staring at him through her veil of hair. But when he turned his head to look directly at her, she was motionless again, her head bowed as before. The elevator slowed as it approached the 19th floor, the soft chime breaking the tension. Alex's brow furrowed. He hadn't seen her press a button. The door slid open to reveal the dimly lit hallway of the 19th floor, its atmosphere strangely darker and more oppressive than his own. Without a word, the woman stepped out. Her movements were as silent as before, her black dress swaying faintly with each step. She didn't turn to look back at Alex, didn't acknowledge him in any way. She simply walked down the hall, disappearing around the corner. The elevator doors closed, and the descent continued. Alex released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He laughed nervously to himself, trying to dispel the tension. "Just another tenant," he muttered, though the words felt hollow. His mind replayed the encounter, and unease gnawed at him. Why hadn't she spoken? Why hadn't she pressed a button? And why had the elevator stopped on the 19th floor, as if it had been summoned for her? The rest of the ride was uneventful, but Alex couldn't shake the chill that had seeped into his bones. When the elevator reached the lobby, he stepped out quickly, his polished shoes echoing across the marble floor. As he made his way to the exit, he passed the receptionist, a cheerful young woman with a bright smile. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks," she chirped. Alex hesitated, glancing back toward the elevators. "Morning," he replied absently, then added, "Do you know if there's a lot of foot traffic on the 19th floor?" I thought it felt different up there. The receptionist tilted her head, her smile faltering slightly. The 19th floor? I don't think so. That level hasn't been rented out in months. Something about renovations that were never completed. Alex froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. Are you sure? I just saw a woman get off there, he said, his voice quieter now. The receptionist blinked, clearly confused. I don't think that's possible, she said. There shouldn't be anyone on the 19th floor. Alex forced a laugh, waving it off. Must have been my mistake. Thanks. He walked briskly out of the building, his mind racing. The city's bustling streets provided a welcome distraction, but as he tried to focus on his meetings and tasks for the day, the image of the woman lingered. He couldn't forget the way she moved, the way the air had felt heavier in her presence. And most of all, he couldn't forget how the elevator had stopped for her, unbidden, as though it had known she was there. By the time he returned to the apartment that evening, Alex had convinced himself it was just an odd coincidence, perhaps a misunderstanding. But as he stepped into the elevator once more, he couldn't help but glance at the control panel. His finger hovered over the button for the 19th floor before he shook his head and pressed 20 instead. When the elevator began its ascent, Alex caught his reflection in the mirrored walls. For a brief moment, he thought he saw her again, standing just behind him. He spun around, his heart pounding, but the elevator was empty. As the doors opened to his floor, Alex stepped out quickly, not daring to look back. But as he approached his apartment door, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. That night, the knocks on the walls returned. Part 4. Disturbances continue. The city had fallen silent under the blanket of night, the usual hum of life fading into an eerie stillness. Alex sat in his apartment, trying to focus on a book. The words blurred on the page, his mind replaying the events of the morning, the strange woman in the elevator, her unsettling stillness, and the receptionist's remark about the 19th floor being uninhabited. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the gnawing unease. You're overthinking, he muttered to himself. But as he turned the page, his heart skipped a beat. A faint sound, barely audible, echoed from above. Tap, tap, tap. Alex froze, the book slipping from his hands onto the couch. He glanced upward. The noise came again, more distinct this time. Footsteps. Impossible. His apartment was on the top floor. There was no one above him. His pulse quickened as the footsteps grew louder, pacing back and forth as though someone were walking in circles. Alex stood, his body tense, straining to listen. Then came the whispering. At first it was faint, like the wind slipping through a crack in the window. But as Alex focused, it grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't the random hum of wind, it was deliberate, fragmented words, spoken in a voice just on the edge of comprehension. Who's there? Alex called, his voice trembling. The whispers stopped. For a long moment, the apartment fell silent again. Alex let out a shaky breath, trying to convince himself it had all been his imagination. But just as he began to relax, the whispers started again, closer this time, as though they were coming from the very walls around him. The temperature in the room plummeted, a bone-deep chill settling into his skin. The lights flickered once, twice, before stabilizing. Alex grabbed his phone, his hands trembling. He opened a flashlight app and stepped cautiously into the hallway outside his apartment. The long corridor stretched out before him, bathed in dim, flickering light. Shadows danced erratically on the walls, their movements unsettlingly human. As he walked toward the elevator, the noises intensified. The footsteps above seemed to follow his every move, echoing in perfect sync. He stopped abruptly, his breath caught in his throat. The sound stopped too. Okay, he whispered, his voice shaky. This isn't real. It's just a bad dream. But the sensation of being watched was palpable, an invisible gaze pressing against his back. He turned, half expecting to see someone behind him, but the hallway was empty. He looked toward apartment 2001. The faint glow of a flickering light seeped through the crack at the bottom of the door. Alex hesitated. His rational mind screamed at him to go back to his apartment, to lock the door and call it a night. But something curiosity, or perhaps an inexplicable pull, compelled him forward. As he approached apartment 2001, a faint sound reached his ears. Crying. It was soft, almost muffled, as though someone were trying to stifle their sobs. Alex's heart ached with the sound, an unexpected wave of sadness washing over him. He raised a hand to knock on the door but froze as the crying abruptly stopped. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing down the empty corridor. No response. Alex leaned closer, his ear nearly touching the cold wood of the door. He heard it again this time, a low guttural whisper, almost like a chant. The lights in the hallway flickered violently, plunging him into brief moments of total darkness. When the light returned, the door to apartment 2001 stood slightly ajar. His breath hitched. He hadn't seen or heard anyone open it. Is anyone in there?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The door creaked open wider, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Every instinct screamed at Alex to turn and run, but his feet refused to obey. Compelled by some unseen force, he stepped closer, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The apartment was empty, its furniture covered in white sheets. Dust hung thick in the air, illuminated by the beam of his flashlight. The crying had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that felt heavier than any noise. Alex scanned the room, his heart pounding. The furniture looked untouched, as though no one had lived here for years. But then his flashlight landed on something that made his blood run cold. On the wall, just above the fireplace, were faint handprints. They were small, like those of a child, and smeared as though they had been dragged downward. His flashlight flickered, the beam growing weaker. In the dim light, Alex thought he saw movement in the corner of the room, a shadow shifting, pulling away from the wall. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice cracking. The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it grew, stretching unnaturally upward until it towered over the furniture. Alex's breath caught in his throat as two glowing eyes emerged from the darkness, staring directly at him. Before he could react, the lights in the apartment flickered and went out completely. The door slammed shut behind him. Panic surged through Alex as he fumbled with his phone, the weak beam of his flashlight doing little to illuminate the room. The whispers returned, louder and more aggressive, surrounding him from all sides. "Let me out," he shouted, banging on the door. The whispers turned into laughter, cold, mocking, and inhuman. Desperation took over, and Alex shoved his shoulder against the door. It burst open, and he stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. The lights outside flickered once more before stabilizing, casting the corridor in its usual dim glow. He turned back toward apartment 2001, but the door was closed, just as it had been when he first arrived. The crying had stopped. The hallway was silent again. Alex staggered back to his apartment, slamming the door shut behind him. His hands trembled as he locked it, sliding down onto the floor with his back pressed against the wood. For a long time, he sat there, his chest heaving with panic breaths. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch toward him, but he refused to look. Sleep was impossible that night. The faint whispers continued, coming from somewhere just beyond the walls, taunting him. Whatever had happened in apartment 2001, Alex knew one thing for certain: he wasn't alone. Part 5. The Haunted Apartment. The following evening, Alex sat in his dimly lit living room, nursing a glass of whiskey. The warmth of the drink did little to chase away the chill that had settled in his bones since the previous night. Apartment 2001 haunted his thoughts, its strange crying and flickering lights replaying in his mind like a broken record. Every creak and groan of the building made him flinch, his senses tuned to an unnatural sharpness. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Curiosity and dread tangled in his chest, pushing him toward a decision he couldn't fully rationalize. "I have to know," he muttered under his breath, his voice trembling as though saying it aloud made the thought more real. Pocketing his phone and grabbing a flashlight, Alex stepped into the hallway. The air felt different tonight, heavier, colder, and eerily silent. The usual hum of the building's machinery seemed distant, muffled. Each step he took echoed faintly, the sound swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. As he approached apartment 2001, he noticed the faint flicker of light under the door, just as he had the night before. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound reverberating in his ears. He hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the door. "Just knock," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Summoning every ounce of courage, he rapped his knuckles against the door. Knock, knock, knock. The sound felt deafening in the stillness, and for a moment, nothing happened. Alex's breath hitched as he strained to hear any movement inside. Then, slowly the door creaked open, as though pushed by an unseen hand. A blast of icy air hit him, so cold it made his breath fog in front of him. The hallway lights flickered, casting distorted shadows across the walls. Alex hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but something unseen compelled him to step forward. The room beyond the door was cloaked in darkness. Alex switched on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the cold air. The apartment looked abandoned, furniture covered in white sheets, thick layers of dust blanketing every surface. The air was stale, carrying the faint metallic scent of decay. He stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath his weight. His flashlight roamed over the room, illuminating an old coffee table, a toppled chair, and a mantel above a fireplace. His eyes were drawn to the mantel, where something glinted faintly under the dust. Approaching cautiously, he saw a photo frame. The glass was cracked, the edges chipped, but the image inside was clear. It was a picture of a young couple, smiling brightly. The woman wore a black dress, the same dress Alex had seen in the elevator, and the man had his arm around her, his face beaming with happiness. Alex's hands trembled as he picked up the frame, the dust smearing under his fingertips. "It's her," he whispered, his throat dry. Before he could process what he was seeing, a soft sob broke the silence. The sound sent a jolt of fear through him, and he whipped around, shining his flashlight toward the source. At first, he saw nothing but shadows dancing on the walls. Then, from the corner of the room, something moved. A figure emerged, stepping into the narrow beam of his flashlight. It was the woman from the photo from the elevator, but she was no longer the smiling figure frozen in time. Her face was a grotesque blend of beauty and decay. Half of it was pristine, her skin pale and smooth, but the other half was rotted and hollow, revealing raw sinew and bone. Her eyes glowed faintly, one filled with sorrow, the other an empty void. "Why? Why are you here?" Alex stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The woman didn't answer. She took a step closer, her movements slow and jerky, as though she were fighting against invisible strings. Her head tilted unnaturally to the side, and her lips twisted into a haunting, sorrowful smile. Alex stumbled backward, the flashlight shaking in his trembling hands. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice cracked with terror. The woman stopped, her glowing eyes locked onto his. "He left me," she whispered, her voice an ethereal blend of anger and despair. He promised. He promised he would stay." Her words hung in the air, each one laced with palpable sorrow. Alex's mind raced. The man in the photo, her partner, had left her. Was that why she lingered here, trapped between life and death? I'm sorry," Alex said, his voice softening despite his fear. "I don't know who he is, but I'm sorry." The woman's expression twisted, her sorrow giving way to rage. The air in the room grew colder, the lights flickering violently. She let out a guttural scream, a sound so unnatural and filled with anguish that Alex felt his knees weaken. Objects in the room began to shake. The coffee table rattled, the photo frame fell from his hands, and the sheets covering the furniture whipped about as though caught in a violent wind. "Leave!" the woman shrieked, her voice reverberating through the room. Alex turned and bolted for the door, his legs moving on instinct. Just as he reached the threshold, the door slammed shut in front of him. He twisted the handle frantically, but it wouldn't budge. Behind him, the woman's footsteps grew louder, closer. He could hear her ragged breathing, feel the icy chill of her presence pressing against his back. Desperation took over, and Alex threw his weight against the door. With a loud crack, it burst open, and he stumbled into the hallway, falling to his knees. The door to apartment 2001 slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. Alex scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding as he backed away from the door. The hallway lights flickered one last time before stabilizing, leaving him bathed in their dim glow. For a long moment he stood there, trembling, staring at the door as though it might swing open again. But it remained closed, silent. Clutching his chest, Alex staggered back to his own apartment. Once inside, he locked the door, slid the deadbolt into place, and collapsed onto the floor. His breaths came in shallow gasps as he tried to process what had just happened. The image of the woman's decayed face burned into his mind, her sorrowful whisper echoing in his ears. For the first time since moving into the building, Alex felt truly and utterly terrified. He was no longer just a visitor in his new home, he was an intruder in hers. Part 6. The Ghost's Revelation. Alex sat frozen on the floor of his apartment, his back pressed against the locked door, as though it might burst open at any moment. His mind raced, replaying the horrifying events in apartment 2001, the icy chill, the shadowed figure, and her face a grotesque fusion of beauty and decay. Her anguished scream echoed in his mind, but beneath it was something else, something he couldn't shake. Sadness. That was the root of her rage. He had seen it in her hollow eyes and heard it in her whispered words, "He left me." But who was he? And why had she chosen this apartment to remain in her torment? The hours passed in restless silence, but Alex knew he couldn't ignore what had happened. He needed answers not just for his own sanity, but for the ghost that haunted the building. She wasn't just terrorizing him. She was trapped, unable to move on, and perhaps she didn't want to. The next evening, Alex found himself standing once more outside apartment 2001. His fear was palpable, his hands trembling as he raised a fist to knock. This time, the door didn't creak open on its own. He waited, the seconds dragging into an eternity. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I just want to talk for a moment." There was nothing but silence. Then, faintly, a soft cry emerged from within. It was a heart-wrenching sound, filled with despair and longing. Slowly, the door opened again, revealing the dark, freezing room. Alex hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to run. But he stepped inside, his breath visible in the icy air. The door closed behind him with a quiet thud, sealing him in. "I know you're here," he said, his voice shaking. "I want to help you. Please, tell me what happened." The silence stretched, oppressive and heavy. Then, a whisper emerged, faint and haunting. "He said he loved me," the voice murmured, echoing through the room. Alex turned toward the sound, his flashlight revealing nothing but shadows. "Who?" he asked. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. "He promised me forever." But he lied from the corner of the room. The figure of the woman emerged once more. She moved slowly, her steps deliberate, her long black dress trailing behind her. Her face was still a harrowing mix of beauty and rot, but now tears streaked down her decayed cheek, shimmering faintly in the dim light. "I was going to be his bride," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and sorrow. "We were so happy. Or at least I thought we were." Alex swallowed hard, his throat dry. What happened? Her eyes locked onto his, glowing faintly in the darkness. "He left me," she said, her voice breaking. "On our wedding day. I waited and waited. But he never came." Her sorrow hung in the air like a heavy fog, and Alex felt his chest tighten. He could almost see it, her joy, her anticipation, crushed under the weight of betrayal. "I came back here," she continued, her voice low and hollow. "This was supposed to be our home, our future. But he took it all away." Her tone shifted, the sorrow giving way to anger. "I was nothing to him. Nothing." She spat, her voice echoing unnaturally through the apartment. The lights in the room flickered violently, and the cold deepened, seeping into Alex's bones. He backed away slightly, his fear growing as her presence became more oppressive. "I couldn't bear it," she said, her voice now a mix of despair and fury. The shame, the pain, the emptiness. I thought, if I ended it, it would stop Alex's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. You took your own life, he whispered. The woman nodded slowly, tears falling from her glowing eyes. But it didn't end. I'm still here, still waiting, still waiting. Still. Hurting, her voice broke into a guttural sob, and Alex felt an overwhelming wave of sadness wash over him. He wanted to comfort her, to reach out and tell her she wasn't alone, but her pain was too vast, too consuming. I see him, she whispered, her tone shifting once again. Every time I close my eyes, I see his face. Laughing. Happy. While I'm here, rotting away, her whispers grew louder, blending into angry mutters that filled the room. The walls seemed to pulse with her fury, and the room shook faintly, as though reacting to her emotion. I'll never forgive him, she hissed, her voice sharp and venomous. And I'll never forgive myself. Alex took a step forward, his fear battling with a growing sense of empathy. You don't have to stay here, he said softly. You can move on. You don't have to relive this pain. Her eyes snapped to him, and the room fell deathly silent. For a moment, Alex thought he had angered her, but then her expression shifted. Move on, she repeated, her voice hollow. There's nowhere for me to go. This is all I have now, this apartment, this sorrow, this hate. You're not trapped, Alex said, his voice firm despite his fear. You're holding yourself here. You can let go. Her face twisted with doubt, her sorrow warring with her anger. How she whispered, her voice trembling. Alex hesitated. He didn't know the answer, but he knew he couldn't leave her like this. Tell me his name, he said. Let me help you find peace. For a long moment, she was silent. Then, with a shuddering breath, she spoke. David, she said, her voice cracking. His name was David. The lights in the room dimmed, and her figure began to waver, as though her energy was fading. Alex felt the temperature rise slightly, the oppressive cold lifting just enough for him to breathe deeply again. I'll find him, Alex promised. I'll make him face what he did, and I'll make sure you're free. The ghostly woman's eyes softened for the briefest moment, a flicker of hope breaking through her anguish. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, replaced by a hollow emptiness. I'll be waiting, she whispered, her figure dissolving into shadows. The room fell silent, and Alex found himself alone once more. As he stepped out of apartment 2001, his mind raced with questions. Who was David? Why had he abandoned her? And most importantly, how could Alex bring peace to a woman who had spent years trapped in the depths of despair and rage? He didn't know where this path would lead, but one thing was certain: he couldn't stop now. Part 7. A desperate escape. The air in Alex's apartment was heavy that night, as though the very walls were pressing inward. Despite the ghostly woman's revelation, there was no sense of resolution. If anything, her sorrowful whispers and piercing cries grew louder, reverberating in his mind even when he tried to sleep. He sat at his desk, the dim glow of his laptop illuminating the room, his thoughts spiraling as he tried to make sense of it all. David, her fiancé. The name felt like a key to unlocking the mystery of her torment, but he didn't know where to begin. Then, the sound started again. At first, it was faint, soft footsteps above his ceiling. Alex stiffened, his pulse quickening. He knew it was impossible. He was on the top floor. There couldn't be anyone above him. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, pacing back and forth as though someone or something was prowling, circling. Not again, Alex whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat. The temperature in the room plummeted. His breath fogged in the cold, and the familiar whispers began, rising from the walls, the floor, and the air itself. They grew louder, blending into an eerie cacophony of murmurs and cries, suffocating him in their intensity. Stop, Alex shouted, slamming his fists on the desk. The voices stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse, an oppressive stillness that pressed against his ears. Then, the lights flickered. One by one, the bulbs dimmed and sputtered out until the apartment was plunged into darkness. Alex fumbled for his phone, the dim glow of its screen casting eerie shadows across the walls. And then he heard it. The knock. It came from his door, this time slow and deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. Alex froze, every muscle in his body tense. He stared at the door, willing himself not to move. Knock, knock. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. The door handle jiggled, and a low, guttural moan seeped through the wood. Gathering what little courage he had, Alex stepped toward the door, gripping his phone like a lifeline. He peered through the peephole, expecting to see an empty hallway. Instead, she was there. The ghostly woman stood on the other side, her decayed face inches from the glass. Her glowing eyes burned with a mix of sorrow and rage, and her mouth twisted into an anguished scream. Alex stumbled back, his phone falling from his hands. The moan turned into a high-pitched wail, a sound that made his blood run cold. The door rattled violently, as though something was trying to force its way in. Desperation surged through Alex as he grabbed his keys and bolted toward the balcony. He flung open the sliding glass door, the cool night air hitting him like a slap. Below, the city was alive with lights and movement, a stark contrast to the horror unfolding in his apartment. The whispers followed him outside, swirling in the air like a storm. David. David, the voices hissed, growing louder, angrier. Alex climbed over the balcony railing, clutching the cold metal with trembling hands. He wasn't thinking clearly, all he knew was that he had to get away. The sound of the whispers reached a fever pitch, and then silence. He turned, his breath catching in his throat. She was there, standing in the doorway to the balcony, her black dress billowing in an unseen wind. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment he saw something other than rage. It was pain. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Instead, a single tear rolled down her decayed cheek, shimmering faintly in the moonlight. "Help me," she mouthed. Then the door behind her slammed shut, and she was gone. Alex didn't wait to see if she would return. He climbed back into the apartment, grabbed his keys and jacket, and ran. He didn't stop until he reached the lobby, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The building manager was behind the desk, a middle-aged man with a stern face and tired eyes. He looked up as Alex approached, his brow furrowing. "You okay, Mr. Brooks?" he asked, his tone cautious. "No," Alex said, his voice trembling. "No, I'm not okay. There's something in this building." "Something wrong?" The manager's face darkened, and he leaned forward slightly. "What are you talking about?" "Apartment 2001, Alex blurted out. "The woman in the black dress. She's haunting it. And she's not just in there, she's everywhere." The manager's expression shifted, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. He glanced around the lobby, as though checking for eavesdroppers, before gesturing for Alex to follow him. "Come with me," he said. They stepped into a small office tucked behind the reception desk. The manager closed the door and gestured for Alex to sit. "I was hoping you wouldn't notice," the man began, his voice low. "What do you mean?" Alex demanded, his voice rising. The manager sighed heavily. "Apartment 2001 has been problematic for years. No one lives there, not anymore. The last tenant, she didn't make it." Alex's stomach turned. "What happened?" The manager hesitated, clearly torn between his duty to the building and the need to tell the truth. Finally, he spoke. "She was young, engaged to a man named David. They were supposed to get married, but he never showed. She came back here, distraught, locked herself in that apartment. And, well, you know the rest." Alex leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "You knew this, and you didn't tell me." The manager's expression hardened. "It's not exactly something we advertise, Mr. Brooks. People don't want to live in a building with history." Alex stood abruptly, his fear and anger boiling over. "She's trapped in there, reliving her pain over and over. Don't you care?" The manager's gaze softened, but his voice remained firm. "What would you have me do? Call an exorcist? Tell the next tenant they might have a ghostly roommate? You think that'll solve anything?" Alex didn't answer. He turned and walked out of the office, his mind racing. As he rode the elevator back to his floor, the oppressive silence returned. He glanced at the control panel, half expecting it to stop at the 19th floor on its own. But it didn't. When he reached his apartment, Alex paused in the hallway, staring at the door to 2001. He felt her presence, her sorrow pressing against him like a weight. "I'll help you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'll find David." He didn't know how, but he had to try. Her cries, her whispers, they weren't just haunting him anymore. They were a call for justice, for release. And he couldn't ignore them. Part 8. Discovering the truth. The fluorescent lights in the manager's office buzzed faintly, casting a cold glow over the cluttered desk piled high with maintenance logs and tenant files. Alex sat stiffly in the chair opposite the building manager, his hands gripping the armrests, as if letting go would cause him to unravel completely. His heart still raced from his desperate escape the night before, the woman's tortured cries echoing in his mind. The manager, a weary man named Mr. Clark, leaned back in his chair, his weathered face heavy with reluctance. His eyes darted toward the door, as if he were afraid someone might overhear. "I'm not supposed to talk about this," Clark began, his voice low and hesitant. "But I've seen enough to know that hiding the truth doesn't make it go away." Alex nodded, his throat dry. "What? What happened in apartment 2001? Clark sighed deeply, rubbing a hand over his face. "Her name was Evelyn," he said finally. "She moved in about 5 years ago. Bright young woman, full of life. She was engaged to be married. Her fiancé's name was David. They were supposed to start their life together in that apartment." Alex's stomach tightened at the mention of the name. He leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happened?" The manager's gaze dropped to the desk, his hands fidgeting with a pen. "David never showed up on their wedding day. Left her waiting at the altar. No calls, no explanations, just vanished." Evelyn was devastated. She came back to the apartment, locked herself inside, and he trailed off, his face grim. Alex swallowed hard. She took her own life." Clark nodded, his expression dark. "We found her 3 days later. She'd hung her wedding dress in the middle of the room, left a note pinned to it. It said, 'You promised me forever.'" The room fell silent, the weight of the story pressing down on Alex like a heavy blanket. He could almost picture her, Evelyn, in her anguish, surrounded by the shattered remains of her dreams. But that wasn't the end. Clark continued, his voice quieter now. "A few months after her death, strange things started happening in the building. Tenants on her floor reported hearing crying, whispers, footsteps, lights flickering, doors opening and closing on their own. Most dismissed it as their imagination. But then people started seeing her." Alex's breath hitched. "Seeing her?" The manager nodded grimly. "They'd catch glimpses of a woman in a black dress, standing at the end of the hallway or reflected in mirrors. Some said she'd appear in the elevator, just staring at them, not saying a word." Alex shuddered, recalling his own encounter. "And the tenants? What did they do?" "Most didn't last long," Clark admitted. "They'd move out after a few months, sometimes even weeks. One man packed up and left in the middle of the night after claiming she appeared in his living room." Alex felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Why hasn't the apartment been rented out since then?" Clark sighed again, his shoulders sagging. "We stopped trying. Every time we'd show the place, something would happen, a sudden chill, lights flickering, the sense that you weren't alone. It scared people off before they even signed the lease. Eventually we gave up. Figured it was better to leave it empty than keep inviting trouble." Alex sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. "She's trapped," he said softly, more to himself than to Clark. "She's stuck here, reliving her pain." Clark nodded slowly. "I've seen it too. The sorrow, the anger. She doesn't mean to hurt anyone, not really. She's just lost." Alex clenched his fists, his determination growing. There has to be a way to help her, to set her free. The manager gave him a long, searching look. "I've worked in this building for 20 years, Mr. Brooks. I've seen things I can't explain. But I've also learned that some wounds can't be healed. Sometimes the past refuses to let go." Alex shook his head. "I can't accept that. She doesn't deserve this." "No one does." Clark hesitated, then reached into a drawer and pulled out an old, yellowed file. "This is everything we have on her. Lease agreements, maintenance requests, incident reports. Maybe there's something in here that can help you understand her better. Alex took the file, his hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," he said, his voice firm. Back in his apartment, Alex spread the contents of the file across his kitchen table. He sifted through the documents, piecing together the fragments of Evelyn's life. Her lease application revealed a young woman full of hope and excitement. Her handwriting was neat, her words optimistic. A handwritten letter from her to the building manager caught his attention. "Mr. Clark, thank you for helping us find this beautiful apartment. David and I are so excited to start our lives here. It feels like home already." Alex's chest tightened as he imagined her sitting in the same building, writing those words with hope and love. But the incident reports painted a different picture. Noise complaints from neighbors described sobbing and screaming in the middle of the night, strange noises from her apartment, even when it was empty. A particularly chilling entry detailed the discovery of her body. The coroner's report clipped to the page. As Alex read, a pattern emerged. Every report, every encounter, seemed to revolve around her pain or betrayal, her despair. The words "you promised me forever" echoed through every account, a desperate plea that tied her to this place. Then, tucked between two pages, Alex found something that made his breath catch. It was a photo, slightly bent at the edges, showing Evelyn and David together. They were standing outside the building, her face glowing with happiness as she leaned into him. But it was David's face that drew Alex's attention. There was something in his expression, a flicker of unease, as though he were already pulling away. Alex's jaw tightened. "I need to find him," he muttered. He couldn't shake the feeling that David held the key to Evelyn's torment. If he could track him down, maybe he could confront him, force him to acknowledge what he had done. Maybe then Evelyn could find peace. But as Alex gathered the documents back into the folder, a sudden chill swept through the room. He froze, his breath fogging in the air. From the shadows of the kitchen, a faint whisper rose. David. Alex turned slowly, his heart pounding. The room was empty, but the whisper came again. Louder this time. "David." The lights flickered, and for a brief moment he thought he saw her reflection in the window, her face twisted in sorrow, her eyes locked onto his. "I'll find him," Alex said aloud, his voice shaking. "I promise." The room fell silent, the oppressive chill lifting slightly. But as Alex sat in the dim light of his kitchen, he couldn't ignore the weight of her pain pressing down on him. Evelyn's story wasn't just a haunting. It was a cry for justice, for closure. And Alex was determined to give it to her, even if it meant facing the darkness head-on. Part 9. Bringing peace. The night was quiet, but Alex's heart was anything but calm. He stood in front of apartment 2001 once more, the photo of Evelyn and David clutched tightly in his hand. His palms were sweaty, his breath shallow. Returning here felt like walking into the jaws of fear, but he knew he couldn't turn back. Evelyn deserved peace, and perhaps so did he. The hallway was still, the air unnaturally cold. The dim light from the flickering bulbs overhead cast distorted shadows that seemed to reach for him. As he reached for the door, he hesitated, his mind screaming for him to leave. But then he heard it, soft, faint, and mournful. Her whisper. David. The sound was enough to steel his resolve. He turned the knob, the door creaking open to reveal the abandoned apartment. The icy air hit him instantly, sharp and biting. His flashlight swept across the room, illuminating the familiar sight of furniture draped in white sheets and the faint handprints smeared on the walls. Alex stepped inside, his breath fogging in the frigid air. He scanned the room carefully, his pulse quickening when he noticed something he hadn't seen before: a small wooden altar, tucked into the far corner. It was simple but unmistakable, its surface layered with dust. A tarnished silver frame sat at its center, holding a faded photo that had long since disintegrated into nothingness. "This is it," Alex whispered. He approached the altar slowly, feeling the weight of Evelyn's presence growing stronger with each step. He placed the photo of Evelyn and David on the altar, carefully aligning it with the empty frame. The moment his fingers left the photograph, the room seemed to exhale. The air grew even colder, and the faint sound of whispers swirled around him, indistinct but mournful. Alex knelt before the altar, his head bowed. He didn't know if what he was doing would work, but he had to try. "Evelyn," he said softly, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry for everything that happened to you. You didn't deserve the pain, the betrayal, or the loneliness. No one does." The whispers intensified, swirling faster, like a vortex of sorrow enveloping the room. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to continue despite the fear clawing at his chest. "I don't know where David is now, or if he ever felt regret for what he did," Alex said, his voice cracking. "But what I do know is that you deserve peace. You deserve to let go of this pain and find rest." The room shook slightly, the vibrations rattling the furniture. The whispers grew louder, sharper, as though Evelyn herself was fighting to hold on. Alex gripped the edge of the altar, his knuckles white. "You don't have to stay here anymore," he pleaded. "You don't have to keep reliving what happened. You can move on. Let yourself be free for a moment." The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, as though the apartment was holding its breath. Then, a soft sob broke the stillness. Alex opened his eyes. Evelyn was standing before him. Her form was more solid now, her black dress flowing gently as though caught in an unseen breeze. Her face was no longer grotesque, though it still bore traces of her torment. Her eyes shimmered with tears, and her lips trembled as she looked down at him. "Do you mean it?" she whispered, her voice fragile and broken. Alex nodded, his own tears threatening to spill. "I do. You deserve happiness, Evelyn. Even if it's not here, you can find it. You can find peace." Her expression softened, and for the first time, a faint smile crossed her lips. She stepped closer to the altar, her hands hovering over the photo. A single tear fell onto the glass, and the room was instantly bathed in a warm, golden light. The oppressive cold lifted, replaced by a comforting warmth that spread through the apartment. The handprints on the walls faded, the flickering light stabilized, and the whispers dissolved into a serene stillness. Alex felt an overwhelming sense of calm, as though a great weight had been lifted from the air. Evelyn turned to him one last time. Her form was glowing faintly now, her edges blurring as though she were dissolving into the light. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with a quiet gratitude. For everything. Before Alex could respond, she faded completely, her presence vanishing like a soft breeze. The golden light lingered for a few moments longer, filling the room with a sense of peace and closure. Then it too faded, leaving the apartment quiet and still. Alex stood in the hallway, staring at the closed door of apartment 2001. The building felt different now, lighter, as though a shadow had been lifted from its walls. For the first time since he'd moved in, he felt like he could breathe freely. But as he walked back to his apartment, he couldn't help but glance at the elevator. His thoughts lingered on the 19th floor and the faint whispers he had heard in the past. He wondered if echoes of Evelyn's sorrow might still remain, tucked away in the corners of the building, faint traces of the pain she had endured. But he hoped, more than anything, that she had finally found peace. That night, Alex slept soundly for the first time in weeks. The air in his apartment was warm, the shadows no longer threatening. But in his dreams, he thought he saw her, Evelyn, smiling in a field of golden light, free at last from the chains that had bound her. It was a fleeting image, but it left him with a sense of quiet reassurance. She was gone now, but her story, her memory, would stay with him forever. Evelyn's pain had been real, her tragedy profound. But in the end, she had found the peace she so desperately deserved. And so had he.